Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of Language Teaching Methodologies. The topic of today's lecture is Audio-Lingual Method. This very lecture is the introduction of Audio-Lingual Method. I am your teacher Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Discussion agenda for today's class is that first of all I will introduce background of audio-lingual method, and then I will discuss briefly the language and learning theory behind this very method. We will also study the goals and objectives. In this lecture we will cover the main features of audio-lingual method, and I will discuss the material being used in this method. So this is the agenda for today's class. So let's start with the background of audio-lingual method. Basically, audio-lingual method is very close to direct method, and direct method is covered in the last lecture, and we examined in that lecture that that method is based on oral approach. Audio-lingual method is also based on oral approach. However, it is very different from the direct method in a way that instead of emphasizing vocabulary acquisition through exposure to its use in the situations, we see that in audio-lingual method, drills are most important for the students. And we see that the audio-lingual method, students drill the grammatical sentence structures or patterns. So it is also different from the direct method because this very method has strong theoretical base in the linguistics and psychology. First of all, we see that Charles Fries, who was from the University of Michigan, he led the way in applying principles of structural linguistics in developing this very method, and for this reason it's sometimes been referred as a Michigan method. We see that the oral and oral approach of the Charles Fries suggests that language should be taught by using intensive oral drilling of the basic patterns of that language. So this method basically emphasizes the proper pronunciation and intonation, but later on we see that some other developments occur in the initial suggestions being given by Charles Fries. Later on, the principles from the behavioral psychology that was formulated by Skinner in 1957, we see that these principles were also incorporated in the basic principles of the audio-lingual method. And these principles of Skinner are that it was thought that the way to acquire the sentence pattern of the target language was through conditioning learners to respond correctly to the stimuli through shaping and reinforcements. So basically, learners could overcome the habits of their native language and form the new habits in the second language that is required to be the target of the language speakers. We see that this very audio-lingual method has other names also, and it is sometimes referred as Army method or New Key method, because this method has a history, and with the outbreak of World War II, American Army needed soldiers to become orally proficient in the languages of their allies and also the languages of their enemies, and they wanted to produce this proficiency in their soldiers in a very short period of time. We see a method was developed for teaching foreign languages that was very similar to the audio-lingual method, and initially this very method was called the Army method. and that army method was based on the works of the Bloomfield. This very method is also known as the new key method, and the name with which we are doing the lecture, the audiolingual method, this very term was actually coined by Nelson Brooke. We see that the theory of the language behind this method is that the theory of the language that is behind audiolingual method, that is of the structural linguistics. And we see that those pedagogists who basically followed the language-centered approach, they believe in the theory of the language that was being suggested by American structural linguists during the 1950s. And these structural linguists, they treated language as a system of systems. And this system consists of several hierarchical linked building blocks that consist of phonemes, morphemes, phrases, clauses, and sentences. And we see each of these very building blocks has their own internal structures. So structural linguists treated language as a system, and they believe that every component or every block of this very system has structure, and by combining these small structures we arrive at the complex system and structure of the language. So this was the theory of language behind audiolingual method. On the same way, we see that the pedagogists, the structural analysts, they see these subsystems of the language linearly, and we see that the subsystems of the language were thought to be linearly connected in a structure, and it is having a system, and we see that this system follows some rules and regulations. And this very structure and system, or the rules, are that certain phonemes systematically cluster together and they form morphemes, and we see that certain morphemes systematically cluster together to form a phrase, and so forth, as I described to you in the last slide. Secondly, we see that the structural linguists, they viewed language as an oral system. Thus, they were initially emphasizing listening and speaking. For these very structural linguists, speech was considered primary and forming a very basis of the language. And we see that structure was viewed as being at the heart of speech. It means that the center or the main focus of the structural linguists was the oral skill. And thirdly, we see that these structuralists believe that every language was looked upon as a unique system, and each of these languages are having a finite number of structural patterns, and each structure can be analyzed, and we can describe these very structures because they are having a system, and we can systematize and grade these very structures, and in the end, when we have that capacity or ability to analyze, describe, and systematize and grade these very structures, then we can apply and we can use these very systems in our teaching and learning process. And when we can use these very things, then students can learn these very things with following this very distinct system or path. So this is the language theory which audiolingual theorists were following. In the same way, there were some other beliefs about the theory of the language, like the structural linguists. They rejected the view of traditional grammarians who depended on the philosophical and mentalistic approach to the study of the language, as we see in the grammar translation method. Instead of that, structuralists claimed to derive their view of language through a positivist and empiricist approach. And from positivism, I mean that it is a philosophical system that recognizes only that very thing which can be scientifically verified or which is capable of logical or mathematical proofs. It means that they were just viewing that very part of the language that is structurally available, and the thing which we can recognize logically or mathematically. And therefore they are rejecting that metaphysical or philosophical or mentalistic concepts that were being attached with the language. So it was thought that a scientific approach to the study of the language would help to identify the structural patterns of the language in a more accurate way. And we see that such an emphasis on the scientific methods of linguistic analysis merge very well with the view of the behavioral psychologists. So this very viewpoint that is being given by the structuralist, it matched and merged well with the views of the behavioral psychologists, because they were also anti-mentalists, and their view of human learning added to and it updated the audio-lingual theory of the language learning. And when we look at the theory of learning behind the audio-lingual method, the proponents of the audio-lingual method, they derive their theory of language learning from the behaviorism. And from behaviorism, I mean that learning is a simple mechanism of stimulus, response, and reinforcement. From this very structure or from this very equation, I mean that the stimulus is the information about the foreign language, any information that the teacher or any other source provide to the learner, and the response is the learner's reaction on the presented material that is presented in the stimulus. And we see that the reinforcement is the natural self-satisfaction of the target language use, and that can be provided internally or externally. Teacher can provide that very reinforcement, or even a student or the learner, he himself can give a self-satisfaction and a reinforcement to himself or herself. So in this very theory, the theory of the learning that is basically connected to the behaviorism, experience is the base of all learning. And we see that all learning outcomes can be observed and measured in the changes that occur in the behaviors. As I told you in the language theory, that basically they are of the positivist approach. Here I am telling you that the behaviorist, they observe and measure the learning process by judging the changes that occur in the behavior. We can add something to the theory of learning in this way, that learning to speak a language is same for these very theorists as learning to ride a bicycle or drive a car. It means that it is very similar to learn any skill. As for example, you are learning to ride a cycle or you are learning to drive a car. In the same way, learning to speak language is a skill. And we see that this very theory of the learning believes that language learning is a process of mechanical habit formation. And this very habit formation occurs through the repetition. And the habit formation takes place by means of analogy. From analogy, I mean habit formation involving in discrimination and generalization, in which we see that the learner discriminates and he arrives at the generalized rules. Instead of analysis, in which we see that the learner is deductively learning rules, as we see in the grammar translation method. Here we see that language learning is a linear, incremental and additive process. Simple things help in learning of the advanced things slowly and gradually. It means that systematically when you learn the initial stages of something, it helps you to learn the complex and advanced things. So language learning is very much linear, incremental and additive process. And the last thing about theory of learning is that language should not be separated from the culture, because language learning and language itself is the part of the culture according to audiolingual or behaviorist theory of the learning. So this is the theory of the learning. Earlier we studied the theory of the language, and after that we see that audiolingual theorists are following the structuralist theory of the language, and in theory of learning they are following the behaviorist theory. Now let's move towards the goals and objectives of audiolingual method, and we can distinguish between the short range and long range objectives of an audiolingual program. When we look at the short range objectives, it includes training in the listening comprehension, accurate pronunciation, and recognition of the speech symbols as graphic signs on the printed page. And it also includes the training in the ability to reproduce these very symbols in writing. So these very short range objectives that are the immediate objectives, these further imply three other short term objectives, and the first is the control of the structures, and these structures belongs to the sounds, and we also include the structures of form and the order in the new language. The second objective is the acquaintance with the vocabulary items that bring content into these structures. First we teach the control of structures, then we add vocabulary to these very structures, and the third part of the objectives of the audiolingual method is that we add meanings in terms of the significance these verbal symbols have for those who speak the language natively. So we are connecting the meaning factor to these verbal symbols. So initially we practice the control of the structures, then we add vocabulary, and then we add the meanings to these very vocabulary. When we study the long-term objectives, that very objective is to use language as native speakers use this very language. So dear students, in practice this very audiolingual method focuses in the early stage on the oral skills with gradual links to the other skills as learning develops. So oral proficiency is equated with, or it means that the learner produce accurate pronunciation, and he should have the ability of the grammatical structures. And another ability that is being developed in the learner is that he or she should respond quickly and accurately in the speech situations. So the teaching of listening comprehension, pronunciation, grammar and vocabulary, all these very things are related to the oral fluency. Reading and writing skills may be taught, but they are dependent on the prior oral skills. So language is primarily speech. These are some of the basic objectives which the teacher or the theorist of the audiolingual method tries to achieve when he is teaching a language to the student. Now let's move toward the main features of audiolingual method. Some of the principles of audiolingual method are very similar to the direct method, but many are different, having been based upon the concepts of the language and learning theories that comes from the linguistics, and from linguistics I mean structural linguistics, and the other field from which the theory of this very method is coming, that is psychology, and specifically the behaviorist psychology. So the following are some of the key principles of audiolingual method that are being suggested by Stern, and he suggested these very principles in 1983. He is the one who suggested the separation of language skills into listening, speaking, reading, and writing. But here he is emphasizing on the teaching of listening and speaking, that is audiolingual skill, before the reading and writing skill, that is graphic skill. So basically they separated these very skills, and after that he gave preference to the listening and speaking over reading and writing. And the second important principle is that of use of dialogues as the chief mean of presenting the language. So the language is presented through dialogues. And the third very concept or the principle of the audiolingual method suggested by Stern is that he laid emphasis on the certain practice techniques, and these very practice techniques are mimicry, memorization, and pattern drills. So basically this is the way which was being emphasized by Stern to learn new language. And in the end, Stern discouraged the use of mother tongue in the classroom. Now let's move toward the William G. Moulton's description of the principles of ALM method. And to him, language is speech and not the writing. The other thing which he suggested is that a language is a set of behaviors. So if you want to learn a language, you have to learn these very behaviors. The third thing which he suggested is that teach the language, not about the language, as we were doing in the grammar translation method. There, when the teacher describes the rules of the grammar, actually he is talking about the language and he is not teaching the language. So to Moulton, the basic thing is that we should teach the language, not about the language. The fourth principle that is being described by Moulton is that a language is what the native speakers say, not what someone thinks they ought to say. So actually language is something that is coming from that very area, and we have to follow the patterns that are being set by the native speakers. And the last and the most important thing is that languages are different. Every language has some patterns, and these patterns are most of the time different from the other languages, though all of them have some basic concepts, but languages are different, and it is not possible to learn languages in the same way. So some other principles of the audiolingual method are that language learning is basically a process of habit formation, and we see that more often something is repeated, the stronger the habit and the greater the learning is. If you're repeating that very thing, we will have a stronger habit formation, and then there will be great learning. If we are forming habit, then there is learning. So language forms do not occur by themselves. They occur most naturally within the context. If you want to learn the forms, for that contextual background is very important. Pronunciation, to the audiolingual method, to the theorists of audiolingual method, and to the teachers of audiolingual method, pronunciation is very important, and the grammatical explanation is minimal. It is not that much central focus, and we see that minimum importance is being given to the explanation of grammatical rules, but we see that most of the time pronunciation is emphasized. Another important feature of audiolingual method is that formation of the correct sentence is very important, because the basis of this method is in the behaviorism, and if student is not forming correct sentence, we see that errors of the students or learner leads to formation of bad habits. So positive reinforcement helps the students to develop correct habits. Another principle of the audiolingual method of any language learning is that each language has a finite number of patterns. As I told you that habit formation is necessary. So we see that this very principle is coming from the structuralist linguistic approach of the language theory, that each language has finite number of patterns. And if we are practicing these very patterns, it helps students to form right habits, which enables the students to use these very patterns in the practical communication. And the last important principle is that that students should overlearn. And from overlearning, I mean that they should learn to answer automatically without stopping to think. Actually, audiolingual theorists want the students to reply automatically, so that the learning or acquisition of the knowledge turns to be their habit. And as we do actions reflexively, in the same way we should reply someone automatically without stopping to think about that very thing. So these are some of the main features of the audiolingual method. Now let's move towards the syllabus that is being used for this very method. Audiolingual method, basically, as I told you in the beginning, is the linguistic or the structured based approach to the language teaching, where the starting point is linguistic syllabus. And as I told you about the building blocks of the linguistic structures, this very syllabus contains the key items of phonology, morphology and syntax, arranged according to their order of presentation. Because I told you about the concept that language learning is linear, incremental and additive process. So basically it is the process in which to students the language is presented in a systematic way, and a language is arranged according to their order of presentation. The language skills are taught in order of listening first, then comes speaking, reading and writing. So listening is viewed largely as training in oral discrimination of the basic sound patterns, and after on that process continues, and we see that there is advancement in the other skills of language learning. The language may be presented entirely orally at first, and written representations are usually withheld in the early stages. So that is the concept behind the syllabus, that language may be presented completely in oral form, and we usually hold the written part of the language for the advanced or for the later stages. So the learner's activity must at first be confined to audiolingual aspect of the language. So recognition and discrimination of these very symbols is followed by imitation, repetition and memorization. So initially the learner has to recognize and discriminate between the audiolingual symbols, and later on he has to recognize and discriminate between the written symbols. So when one is thoroughly familiar with sounds, arrangements and forms, then they can center their attention, or then they can focus their attention on expanding and enlarging their vocabulary, and afterwards they will concentrate upon gaining accuracy, and that is being done before striving for fluency. So vocabulary comes after recognition and discrimination of the sounds, arrangements and forms, and in the same way we see that accuracy comes before the fluency in the speaking skill. After that, in the syllabus, when reading and writing are introduced, students are taught to read and write what they have already learned to say orally. In this method, we see that an attempt is made to minimize the possibility of making mistakes in both speaking and writing by using tightly structured approach to the presentation of new language items. At more advanced levels, more complex reading and writing tasks may be introduced. this is all about the syllabus. Now let's look at the material used in the ALM method. Instructional material in the audiolingual method assists the teacher to develop language mastery in the learners. They are primarily teacher oriented, not student oriented. And we see that student textbook is often not used in the elementary phases of the course, where students are primarily listening and they are just repeating and responding to the teacher. So at this stage in learning, exposure to the printed words may not be considered desirable. And they do this because the introduction of the printed material or printed words may distract the attention from the listening input or the oral input. So the teacher will have access to the teacher's book that contains the structured sequence of the lessons to be followed in the syllabus, and that very book also has the dialogues and drills and other practicing activities, but only teacher has access to that very material. Students or the learners are not having exposure to the printed words. When textbooks and printed material are introduced to the students, actually they are provided with the text of the dialogues and the cues that are needed for the drills and the exercises, which they have already done orally. And here in the textbook, the same dialogues and the cues that are needed for the drills and exercises are provided in this very text. Tape recorders and audiovisual equipments are being used, and they are having the central role in the audiolingual course. And in the same way, we see that a language laboratory may also be considered the essential part of audiolingual method, because it provides the opportunity for further drill works and to receive controlled and error-free practices of the basic structures that are being used by the teachers. These very language labs also add variety by providing an alternative to the classroom practices. So a taped lesson may first present a dialogue for listening practice that allows the students to repeat the sentences in the dialogues line by line, and it provides the follow-up fluency drills on the grammar and pronunciation. So that is all about the material being used in the audiolingual method. So today we studied about the background of audiolingual method. We also studied the language theory and the learning theory that is being used in this method, goals and objectives, main features, and the material being used in the audiolingual method is also discussed. I hope that now you will be having basic idea about this method. I will explain this very method in detail in the second lecture. So thank you very much for listening passionately.